So this short presentation is on a number of tools that I think can be useful in addition to some of the ones that we discussed earlier under operations consulting. A few extra tools that we can use whenever you're working on operations projects or even if you're doing operations consulting as well. And those tools are not necessarily specific to operations management, but that they can be used quite often when you're investigating a situation in an operation system. So some of those tools you're already familiar with, like the SWOT analysis, force field analysis, benefit cost analysis, and break-even analysis. So these are things that break-even analysis you tend to find in finance, as well as benefit cost analysis in finance, but also just looking at economic issues. And in some cases, when you're creating a business case for a particular major initiative, you would have to tend to do a benefit cost analysis as well. Force field analysis is quite useful when we have initiatives to implement, or we're trying to manage change, and we want to do a sort of an examination of all the types of forces that are at play as we attempt to bring about the change. And of course, the common SWOT analysis that most people are aware of. But I wanted to talk about that one, even though I know most people know about it, because I think that there's an opportunity that is often missed when I've seen it used in projects. It is, the use of the SWOT analysis tend to be very limited by most individuals that I've seen use it. So I want to just show you an opportunity here to use it a little better than what you've done in the past. So SWOT analysis, I think we all know what that is: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And it's a very common tool used in strategic planning. But when a number of students have to do case reports, for some strange reason, whether or not one is needed, I often tend to see a SWOT analysis of the company. But further on in the report, I very rarely see the information used for anything else, except just to say these are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats facing the company. Now, if you think about the weaknesses and the strengths part, essentially those are internally focused. When we talk about what are the strengths of this company and its weaknesses, we're often actually speaking about a number of operational things, but also it could be finance related, it could be marketing related. So you have a scan of the internal organization. When we speak of the opportunities and threats, we're often looking at the external environment to see what threats there are that could create issues for the organization, or what opportunities that can be explored or exploited by the organization. And so these are just some examples. I think most of you are familiar with examples of SWOT analysis, but here's a case here. We could have superior quality, lowest price, best expertise, great location, wonderful facility, strong partnership relationships, an efficient supply chain. All of those things can be part of your strengths. Weaknesses, you could have an inferior location, high overheads, lacking of some strategic skills. You have a tired brand, an inability to move into new markets very quickly. You have long product development lead times. All these can potentially be weaknesses that could create problems. An opportunity might be there might be a regulatory change, perhaps in the tax rates, and that could then create some opportunities for the company. There's a high-profile event taking place, so there's a chance for the company to market. There's an untapped market, or there's growing markets. Somehow a company has actually failed, and there's now an opportunity to take up the slack where they've left off. So threats, on the other hand, can potentially damage the organization. A new entrant into the market, some unfavorable regulation that may potentially drive costs up or make you less competitive. Problems with the economy as we've been experiencing lately, market shrinkage and so forth. Substitute products in the market as well. That could create some issues. Now, when most people do a SWOT analysis, as I said, they simply populate the 4 quadrants or these 4 dimensions. But one of the things that's missing is that there are a number of interesting strategies that could come from combining the 4 dimensions. For example, if we were to take, we see here SO, W, ST, and WT. These are potential strategies that a company can develop when it looks at the intersection or the interaction of these dimensions. So for example, SO, what does that mean? It means that there are some strengths that you could leverage to take advantage of some opportunities. WO strategies are those that attempt to enhance or improve on weaknesses to take advantage of opportunities. ST strategies are the ones where you use your strengths to combat or minimize potential threats. And then WT strategies are the ones where you would, in some cases, say, we may need to no longer produce this product or get out of this market. There are some weaknesses that you have and there's some potential threats, and you try to mitigate against that. One of the things you could do is to build the strengths that you need to then be able to deal with the threats, or you could simply shut down and say we will sort of remove ourselves from this threatening situation. All right, so all of these are possibilities. And there's some names that you give them. SO strategies we tend to call maxi strategies, using a strength to maximize an opportunity. And there's mini maxi opportunities, WO, which is improving a capability to maximize an opportunity. And then you have the maxi mini strategy, ST, which is utilizing strength to mitigate against a threat. And you have a mini strategy, which is minimizing your weaknesses and threats at the same time. So to minimize your weakness, obviously you have to build some strengths with that. All right, so that's just what I wanted to make sure that you're aware of, that don't just simply put a SWOT analysis on the table without exploring those intersections and seeing what could actually come out of it. And so in any cases that you do a 4-hour class, I want to see that kind of analysis conducted. Force field analysis is a very powerful tool. In a number of cases, when students analyze a particular issue or case, they will make several recommendations, but very few go beyond just stating the recommendations. I mean, there's so many things you could do for your recommendations. You could analyze them for the benefit cost analysis, for the benefits versus the cost that they will deliver. You could analyze them in terms of the effectiveness in dealing with the particular goal or issue. You can analyze them for implementation, and that's where force field analysis comes in. Force field analysis essentially says when you have a change, a desired state that you want to get to, it is possible that there are forces, because of human nature, because of organizational dynamics, there are forces that work against that particular initiative. But then there are forces that will help to drive it as well. And so you have restraining forces that prevents it from happening, driving forces that could push it. And as you can see in this diagram, we would love to get to this desired state right here. Unfortunately, we have forces keeping us from getting there. So we have to go through this process where this is our status quo, and we got to bring about the change to get us to this point. So force field analysis essentially requires that you identify all the possible forces. So to carry it out, list all of the forces for change in one column and all the forces against the change in the other column. Assign a score to each, to get a sense of to what extent these forces are weak versus strong. And in the end, when you sort of do that analysis, you get a feeling of where is the balance of power. Are the forces that are against stronger than the forces that are for the change? And depending on how you analyze that, there are some strategies that you're going to have to develop to deal with the imbalance in the power of the forces. All right. So we could actually diagram this, a model built on this idea that forces, persons, habits, customs, attitudes both drive and restrain change, right? So it can be used at any level of an organization to visualize the forces that may work in favor and against change initiatives. The diagram helps its user to picture the tug of war between the forces around a given issue. So the same diagram, this is another diagram of the very same thing, and the different forces. This is a way of demonstrating the strength of a force. So the ones that are fairly long, as you could say, then they are the significant forces. The ones that are shorter are not as strong. So this is a nice pictorial representation of your force field. All right, and we've already mentioned that it allows you to sort of investigate the balance of power in terms of restraining forces versus driving forces. All right, and here's an example. We want to upgrade a factory for new manufacturing machinery. Well, what are the forces for change? Customers want new products, as an example. We want to improve the speed of production, raise volumes of output, and maintenance costs are increasing, so we want to drop that down. That will certainly help. In terms of forces against, well, perhaps with the more efficient piece of equipment, you may lose overtime, and some staff may not like that. Some staff might not be too cool on the new technology. There might be some environmental impacts. There could be some cost issues and some disruption in terms of your current production. So when you look at these forces, you see 11, they're given weights, and we have 10 versus 11. The main thing is, I would say, yes, you look at these numbers, but in each case, once you identify that a particular force is significant, the question is, how do you, if it is a driving force, take advantage of it, and if it is an inhibiting force, how do you try to eliminate it? And that will make for some very interesting discussion. At St. Mary's University, we had a very interesting example where we attempted to initiate a Bachelor of Business Administration, different from a Bachelor of Commerce. And we were trying to cater to a new market, which would be, for example, students who complete 2 years at NSCC. They could come in and do the BBA program. And we had a major tug of war between those who supported the idea, who felt, well, it would open up some new markets for us, and give us, of course, an opportunity for us to experiment a bit with the BBA program, since to a large extent we're fairly not rigid, but we are in a state of equilibrium with our Bachelor of Commerce program. But then you had the folks who were against it, who said that it was going to cannibalize our commerce program. It was BCom Light. It was going to have major implications for staffing. So we had forces that were against it, forces that were for it. Well, I'm sure you're aware that we have no BBA program. So what does that tell you? It tells you that the forces that were against it actually won out. And we didn't come up with the strategies for turning those inhibiting forces into driving forces. Quite interesting. We will move on to break-even analysis. In many cases, when some case analysis is done, or a particular operation system is analyzed and recommendations are made, sometimes the recommendations have cost implications. You make a change because you anticipate some benefits. Sometimes the benefits are quantifiable in terms of dollars, sometimes they're not. But we need to find a way to do some evaluation of whether or not the change or the initiative we want to implement will deliver some value. So benefit cost analysis, I'm talking about benefit cost analysis. This is actually break-even analysis. My apologies here. So I'll go back and start this all over again here, this little section. In this section, we will look at break-even analysis. And break-even analysis tends to occur when we're considering perhaps the production of a new product. And there's some costs associated with this new product. There's some fixed costs associated with the manufacturing of that product. The fixed cost could come from, say, some new capital equipment that we have to purchase and so forth. And we often want to determine, well, what is the break-even point? And if we cannot reach the break-even point, or if the market cannot support that break-even point, then it doesn't make any sense to go ahead with the particular initiative. So really, it's a decision-making aid that enables the manager to determine whether a particular volume of sales will result in losses or profits. And in some cases, the analysis is done to determine whether or not you're going to go ahead and produce this product in the first place. So the idea is that we have these 4 sets of costs or revenues. So we have fixed costs, variable costs, revenue, and profit. And if we were to do some analysis on different production volumes, we could determine for different production levels what the profit levels are, and whether or not the quantity that needs to be produced to generate a profit is in fact achievable. So we could use break-even analysis to look at monthly expenses to see if our income is more than our expenses, determine the minimum price that can be sold, that we could charge for a product, or we could determine the optimum price a product can be sold for, depending on how much profit we want to make. Or we could calculate the effects of marketing programs on price, because marketing programs can drive potentially different sales volumes. The break-even formula is fairly straightforward, that if we sell a certain amount of a product, say X, then we have, and if P is the price per product, then the break-even formula basically says that you break even when your revenues turns out to be equal to your cost. All right. In other words, that's when you have zero profit. So we have a fixed cost F, and then we have the variable cost, which is V multiplied by the quantity. So if our unit cost is $2 and we produce 100, so our variable cost would be 200 units. We could have $1,000 for fixed cost, and if we're selling the product at $5 and we produce 100, then 500 turns out to be our 5 multiplied by 100. $500 turns out to be our revenues. But you could see already that 500 is less than 1,000, so this is not the break-even quantity. We would need a lot more than that to break even. All right, and we could diagram this where our revenue line is just a straight line. If we have no sales, we have no revenues. But with our costs, we will incur that fixed cost F, and then this is the variable part, which is just a linear function. So at some point, obviously the slope of the income has to be larger than the slope of the cost. If it's not, then that means that you're selling at a loss, right? And at some point they will cross. So if you wanted to decrease the quantity that you have to sell to generate a profit, if you want to go back here, it would mean that you'd have to change the slope of this line, which basically means you'd have to sell at a higher unit price. Okay, so break-even analysis is a fairly useful tool. To determine your break-even quantity, if you could just do some rearranging of that formula that we saw earlier, then it turns out that the break-even quantity is the fixed cost divided by the gross profit. In other words, the profit that you make per unit. So if I'm selling my product for $5 and it cost me $2 to make it, my gross profit per unit is $3. So that $3 have to help me recoup the fixed cost F, and X will be the quantity that I must produce in order to recoup that. Any quantity greater than X then turns out to be profit after that. All right. Last but not least, we want to talk about benefit cost analysis, and that's often done when we are selecting projects. And if you think again about improving an operation system, often there are a number of projects that are involved. So if we're going to implement these projects, and these projects have costs associated with them, in some cases these projects may actually be generating future cash flows then we got to be able to do a bit of benefit cost analysis. And so we want to assess projects by looking at the benefit cost ratio, by looking at the net present value and the internal rate of return. So those of you, of course, if you've done finance already, would have come across pretty much all of these. But I just wanted to refresh your memory and let's remind you that when we do operations analysis, that we actually borrow these tools and bring them to bear on the decisions that we're making in this environment. All right? So we use these tools or these measures as part of evaluation. So we need to identify what the benefits are, we need to evaluate what are they worth, and then of course we need to be able to measure them. Some of them can be measured directly, some of them have to be measured indirectly, some of them are tangible versus intangible, and some of them are pecuniary effects. That they have some cost implications later on that we need to certainly consider, right? So there is this concept that if a project has cash flows over a long period of time, that we want to know at this point when we're making the decision, what is that worth? So hence the concept of the present value of the initiative. So, and we know that money now typically is worth more than money later because of inflation. The value of the dollar drops over time. And so $100,000 5 years from now is not worth $100,000 today unless you had zero inflation. So we got to figure what that actually cost us. So we use discounting as a way of being able to assess what is the current value of a future payout. So frequently costs and benefits occur at different times. Money has time value. Current dollars are more valuable than future dollars, and therefore we need to place a current and future costs and benefits on an equal footing to compare them. And we try to do that today as opposed to in the future. All right. So discounting, we need something called a discounted rate that we apply, and that discounted rate helps us to take the cash flow into the future and bring it back to the present. So we have discounted rate versus interest rates. Well, interest rates help money to grow. Discounted rates, we work backwards, and it actually decreases the value of the money. So 3% interest rate on a $100,000 invested will be about in 5 years $115,927. However, $100,000 in 5 years, discounted at the same rate, 3%, is only worth $86,260 today. Alternatively, you could say if you invested $86,260 today at a rate of 3%, then you should have $100,000 in 5 years. All right. The discount rate matters, which basically means that the different values have different implications. So if we discounted at 3% versus 5%, the higher the level of discounting, the less the value of the money in present day figures. And then if you use a longer planning horizon, then you're discounting even further. And if the benefits happen deeper into the future than they happen more recently, then that also causes a sort of a smaller present value of the future benefits. So the deeper they are into the future, when they're discounted, they're worth a whole lot less today. So what can we use as a discounted rate? Sometimes it's given to you. Somebody says, okay, use a 5% discount rate. Sometimes we use the bank interest rate. Sometimes we use rates of return on certain investments, such as government bonds, or what we call social discount rates. It's really not very clear exactly what you use, but as long as you have some rationale for selecting a rate, then that's fine. And then we have the difference between discounted benefits and total benefits, and that gives us the measure of the present value. So if you could quantify the benefits and quantify the costs, then take the present value of both of those and then you subtract them and you get the net present value. The higher the net present value, the better the project performance. Benefit cost ratio, if we take the same present value of the benefits and we divide it by the present value of the cost, we get a benefit cost ratio. and we could use that. Of course, we want higher benefit cost ratios. So if you have multiple competing projects, the ones with the higher ratios are the ones you'll select. And then finally, the internal rate of return is essentially a rate that you would compute that would discount your benefits or your cash flows in such a way that your net present value is zero. So it's kind of like a benchmark. And then once you compute that, if depending on what your discounted rate is or your rate of return is, we would select the different projects and so on. So the higher the rate of return, the internal rate of return, in other words, if you need a large rate to discount to zero, the higher it is, the better it is. Because it means that, let's say, for example, the average interest rate is 5%, or the discount rate that you would use is 5%, but your internal rate of return is 10. It means that you have to heavily discount your future cash flows to bring it down to zero. But if you use 5%, it will not be discounted as much, which means that its present value will be actually positive. Okay, but if your internal rate of return is smaller than your discounted rate, that means that your net present value would likely be negative. And so you want to select projects with higher rates of return, internal rates of return, and that makes it a whole lot better. Okay. So what we know is that net present value and benefit cost ratio, generally they're correlated, but under different circumstances the measures can perform differently, and we may not necessarily choose the same projects depending on which criterion we use. Okay. And this is just reiterating the same thing here, saying that they are similar but not identical. With multiple projects, some may do better on the net present value analysis, some do better on the sort of benefit cost ratio. And that's because the present value of the cost versus the present value of the benefits, when you use the benefit cost ratio, it doesn't take in the initial capital cost at time period 0. And that is why you tend to get slightly different results. If all the initiatives use the same initial costs at time 0, or whether that's capital costs or investment costs, if they use the same value, then chances are that the benefit cost ratios will give you the same ranking of the projects as the net present value. Okay. And what I've just said is just sort of been articulated here.